Now, Delilah Luna Moreno from Oracle, who is going to show us all the incredible benefits of relying on one connected system to handle processes, mappings, onboardings, adding additional business units, and more in order to operate efficiently and provide the best healthcare for patients. Delilah, are you with us today?
I sure am. Good
All right,
afternoon.
I'm going to stop sharing and you may take it away.
Wonderful. Can you see my screen?
I can.
All
I'm
right.
getting your full screen.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Joe, for that introduction. And how can I follow on the footsteps of a COVID-19 topic? I mean, really, hopefully folks will find this topic valuable. It is valuable to me, and I would argue that it has a direct correlation to COVID-19. So the topic that I discussed with NRL that I thought would be extremely entertaining and valuable to discuss with you guys today is basically connecting and maintaining your clinical systems all the way to the enterprise accounting platform. And as you would imagine, that sounds like a mouthful, but by show of hands, how many of you guys that are currently in the healthcare industry responsible for some element of systems maintenance or any kind of the recipient of incorrect maintenance on your current roles? So Joe, I don't know if you can tell me, but I suspect that most of you on one way or another are being either impacted or are responsible for some of the data sets maintenance that are pervasive throughout the entire clinical platform. So before we get started, a little bit about myself. I've been in the healthcare industry my entire professional career. And for those of you that hopefully are not doing math, it's been over 20 years. My roles within the healthcare organizations that I worked with have been several, mainly within the systems implementation, several ERPs, several business intelligence, process flow improvements, and within the business intelligence, a little bit of the decision support. And as I implemented some of those systems, I also stayed with some of the elements of production support, anywhere from ERP, supply chain, and up to and including EMRs. My latest role is that of a healthcare business architect, and I continue to see this topic, which is the reason why I have the benefit of talking about this today. So today, what we're going to cover is, in essence, two different topics, but they are very much interconnected. The first topic, and the one where we're going to spend a lot of time on, is connecting and maintaining your clinical systems. The second topic is, after you connected and maintained all of your data sets, let's go for Holy Grail, which is connecting the clinical systems to your enterprise accounting platform. And after that, if we have some time, we would go through some closing comments. So with that said, a bit of information here. Operational excellence, we believe, is key to succeed as a healthcare business. And I would argue that in today's world, and not any different than it was before we went and shut down, it was critical to be up in an operational excellence. And operational excellence means different things to different folks. However, from an information management perspective, is the conversation for today. As you can tell in some of my statistics here, and healthit.gov and other, we know that in today's world, over 99% of US hospitals are using an electronic healthcare record. And that's where the story sort of starts getting convoluted from a healthcare perspective. Average hospitals now in today's world have an average of 16 different clinical vendors. And that's just on the clinical side of it. And that is coming from a Healthcare IT News article by Robert Watson. In addition to that, you have varied data sources and formats that have made it extremely difficult for healthcare organizations to reliably gather and share information. And it is my personal experience, when I was supporting the healthcare industry, I was dealing with over 400 applications. And that is a huge task to maintain and coordinate and align, more importantly. The last piece of information that I want to bring up to you guys is the Managed Healthcare Executive article, The Biggest Issues Facing in Healthcare Today. Number 4 is data and analytics. And I would argue that you cannot have analytics without an organized data set. So the main topic that we're going to talk about, right, is connecting and maintaining your clinical systems. And so as we're talking about your clinical systems, right, one of the things that I wanted to share with you guys is that one of my roles, one of my latest operational role was to support the revenue cycle. And one of those responsibilities is to set up providers. On a Friday afternoon, when I was responsible for the Epic revenue cycle, I found out that a renowned surgeon from our community was joining our organization, and I was over the moon until I found out that he was starting on Monday. And I will have to, at that point, ensure that Epic was set up with his provider information, ensure that I understood not only all of the credentialings that he had, but also the new department that was being created under him. And so that brings me to managing changes, right? And in the enterprise, right? So this use case that I just told you, right? This provider created a new department, and he also created a new cost center. And I would argue that he also had a project because he brought with him some grants under his belt. And then we had to not just only update the EMR, but we also had to update the clinical system as well. So notice that that very routine change was a lot to handle in the last minute, but not to mention the fact that all of the downstream applications such as productivity and revenue and capturing the revenue and booking the journal entries. So that is at the core of what we're talking about today. Other data sets, right, changes come about as a function of either transformational changes, either be a business organizational change or a digital system, as you're seeing in this slide. Obviously, we can have corporate reorganizations, and that's where everything starts breaking down and does not give us the ability to have data insights and, more importantly, efficiency or answering the questions that with regards to any shifts in our revenue. So how do we tackle that? Well, we know what best practices are. It doesn't take a brain surgeon, right? No pun intended, but the first thing you need to do is implement a data governance strategy very early on. Well, I think in our case, a data governance obviously was not there because I found out on a Friday afternoon that we had a new provider coming in here. So clearly there was no data governance. The other best business practice is establishing a centralized repository, which once again, we did not have, not even in an email format because I was not told. Another best practice, right, is making that data accessible. Why? Because you would want to understand what is the mapping of this provider or whether this provider has other grants. So there's different flavors to different function of folks that would need access to that data. And last but not least, we want to close the quality gap, ensuring that this provider on all of the systems that he needs to be set up and downstream processes that require that information is also set up properly. So if we know how to do it right, why aren't we doing it right? Well, it was my experience because I was working with on-prem solutions that each individual application had their own way of mapping, and the way that we were communicating this information was for the most part either picking up the phone and telling somebody or in the form of an email, which does not lend itself to a organized data governance process flow. So let me bring it down to one specific example of a data set so that we can dissect it and understand not just how pervasive this data set issue may be, but also how fragmented it is. So in the case of this renowned surgeon that we were onboarding, obviously he first became an employee. So surely somebody in the organization had an employee, and obviously we need his name, and maybe, as in the case of Mount Sinai, New York, they needed to see this security badge, right? we also probably need to set him up in all of the clinical systems. And as we already stated, it's very likely that in some organizations you have more than one, given the different specialties or whether it's acute and non-acute side of the house. Not to mention the fact that this provider, we need to vet the credentialing. We also need to obtain a national provider ID and so on. So as you can tell, these are some of the information that just for this one provider, we needed to know in all of these different departments. So what do we know about this data set? That it was fragmented, right? We had multiple departments that needed that information, but maybe just a subset of that information. Well, we also know that there were different processes. And by different processes flows, let's take the example of him being an employee. Probably HR was one of the first departments that knew about this provider coming on board, and they probably needed to send him a contract. So now maybe we need to store that contract and we need to know who has it. That timeline is probably the first touch point with regards to this record. But let's take the example of either credentialing. Well, we can onboard the provider. He can provide clinical services, but he cannot provide services within the hospital until we have vetted and confirmed the credentialing information with regards to the hospital. So that comes much later on. And another example of a downstream process, right, will be physician productivity. Once this provider has been providing services in making, surgeries, providing surgeries in the hospital, now we want to know how productive it is, and that's most likely happening 6 to 9 months down the road. All of this data is available at different times, but yet they all have the same thing in common, which is the provider. And this is exactly one of the perfect scenario of the use case, that this provider has different departments that need specific information for them. They own the information, the functional side owns the information, and they have different processes. So a lot of the pain points that we had is that the information that we needed was not available at the time that we needed it. And downstream, the information broke down and we could not be able to report or even tell somebody how many grants are available for this provider. So if we know what the best business practice is, and we also know what the example is and we know what not to do, then how do we solve for this puzzle? Well, I would argue that in today's world, we have the ability and the functionality to govern your changes, that it will allow you to centralize and govern all of your enterprise data sets in one location with request workflows where you can enter the information initially, and that the different functional folks / departments will get a notification to let them know that something just happened, and that either be prepared for it or start working on this credentialing, start working on obtaining the grants information. So this best practices allows you to centralize the data sets, allows you the ability to have visibility, allows you the ability to share that information and propagate it through many different systems across the entire organization. Now, not just available, the information is not just available and centralized. Now, I would argue, and it has been my experience, that in most of the healthcare organizations that I've worked, out of all of the ones that I worked, there was only one organization that officially had a department that was labeled information management. And that's usually where we see these data sets being maintained and owned. But I would argue that the information management department does not know, nor do they own the specific data sets, either associated for HCM or for the grants, that resides within that individual department. And that's the beauty about creating that governance and the security that goes along with it. It allows you to provide the subscriptions to the different departments. You give them the permissions that is needed for them to maintain their specific subsets of the information in a timely fashion, but yet it provides you the visibility to ensure that that entire record now has all the information that it needs and propagate it back down to all of the legacy systems, up to and including, if needed, the ERP. So if we know that that now we have the ability from a functionality perspective to set it up, these are some of the values that we derive from it, right? The first thing I would say is data alignment. Now, this provider and all of this information has the visibility and ownership, but maybe the IT department or maybe information management, but each individual functional department will own and maintain their own information. Now, you'll have the agility to see the information, report on it, and more importantly, be able to maybe through dates, begin or end dates, you have the agility to create a record or inactivate the record and set up a new record as changes are happening within the organization. But more importantly, you have one of the most valuable things that you will derive from creating data sets and maintaining them in a centralized format is going from an insight to an action. Now your information is readily available. You can see whether there's an issue and you know that it's mapping. You are minimizing and you're being proactive with regards to any exception reporting. In the case that I was outlining for you, what was true for us is that most likely at end of month, that revenue associated to that provider was going to go into an exception bucket, and nobody would have known where does this revenue belong to, because nobody knew about this provider being onboarded in a timely fashion, but more importantly, because they were not communicated. This platform allows you to have the visibility and be able to start and asking the questions, and more importantly, creating the actionable items to update the information that you are responsible for. At the end of the day, some of the benefits from within the operational world you will have are a collaborative approach. You'll be able to see what everybody, the data set, what everybody needs, but more importantly, you'll be able to take ownership of the piece that you need to maintain. It's application specific. Why? Because now I don't have to go directly into the credentialing application or to the research application. I can propagate this information back down to these applications and they will consume it, but you will have one set of truth in one place where it's being maintained. And last but not least, it gives you visibility and audit history as well, which is just as valuable. When we know things are maintaining correctly, we usually have to ask how it was mapped before, so then we can correct it properly. So that is a lot to cover in such a short period of time. But if there's anything that I want you guys to take away from this topic, is that I just gave you one of many data sets that are applicable within the healthcare industry. Provider, I would argue, is one of those that is the most visible, but there are so many different other data sets, such as your bill area, mapping to your accounting unit. I would argue that all of the hierarchies and reporting, all the way up to and including trying to see and monitor maybe CPT codes in their grouping. So any and all data sets associated to your organization, you can use the best business practices and this platform that would allow you to maintain and get you prepared for a best business practice in operational excellence. Now, once you have organized your organization and now you have visibility and everybody has mapped all of the data sets that they are responsible for, I would argue that the holy grail would be the accounting hub. Right now, what you're seeing here is Adventist Health has started that journey of getting information asymmetry. They did implement this model of centralizing a data set and then propagating it back down to their systems. And it's a journey, not a destination, right? You have the ability to create the tools and that you have the tools to create all of the different process flows and monitor the information and provide the reporting. This is just a quote from the Director of Analytics, Matthew Savard. that he was obviously part of the project that implemented this approach. Now, as I was saying before, the holy grail of information management, I would argue, is connecting the clinical system to the enterprise accounting platform. And the reason why I feel that way is because at the end of the day, this is truly where you're measuring the dollars, where you're matching the dollars to the expenses, and you're actually monitoring the bottom line. So if I already have a data set that is fully mapped, and if I would have mapped that provider in a timely fashion, and all of the revenue was mapped properly, then all that I needed to do was to connect that information from the clinical system to the back office. And what we know to be true today in our healthcare, in the healthcare industry, is that almost there's a huge divide. There is the clinical system world, and then there's the back office. And we have never been able to close that gap and create the bridge. And I would argue that creating the bridge starts with information management and creating those data sets. Now, if you already have the data sets, you're maintaining them, and you can map them, one of the things that we are used to thinking about from an integration perspective from the clinical system to the back-end office is literally creating the mapping, manually creating the mapping of the clinical system over to the chart of accounts, and then uploading the journal entry. I would argue that that is usually the way we do it, and we did it because we didn't have anything else. And that's how we see it today. The issue with that is that who are the folks that are maintaining the clinical systems with regards to the accounting information? Where they are clinical folks. More importantly, they do not know the accounting, the chart of account, nor the string. So the right folks to maintain that information, I would argue, is on the accounting side of the house. So the new normal and the approach to operational excellence would be to create and connect the electronic medical records or the legacy systems such as clinical trials and maybe your fundraising software. You not only you would connect them, but you will create a subset of the data from the legacy systems, and you will define accounting rules, bring over additional fields that are needed in order to be able to answer variance analysis, and ultimately create and define the accounting rules that you once had over on the left-hand side, which was the electronic medical record or the clinical trials. You bring it over into the chart of accounts. The accounting department or the finance side of the house determines the accounting rules, maintains them, and the rules transforms the accounting, creates and automates the journal entry at month end, and at the end of month, you have full visibility. I would argue that one of my goals was to have the EMR integrated on a daily basis, but the real issue was always the mapping and the assumptions that we had to deal with that. But if you set up the information management side of the house, you create your data sets, and then you create your accounting rules. Now, not only do you have agility around the data, you have visibility, you have efficiency, you have the correct data and the timeliness to close your month-end process. Some of the benefits around this enterprise accounting platform obviously are connectivity. Not only you could connect your electronic medical record, and let me be clear, we're not saying that we are going to take all of the records that are happening on the clinical side of the house. It's a subset. The subset is going to be defined by your organizational needs and the desired visibility. And once you determine that granularity, then you will add the accounting rules engines to go along with that. The other benefit that I would argue that you have is also the transactability of it, right? You now have transactional information that once only resided in the legacy systems. Now you have access to see it. And now, as we have been saying for almost decades now, you truly have a single source of the truth residing in one single accounting platform. Once again, the chart of accounts, and we have seen in some of the organizations, and I personally have experienced it, where I was dealing with not one, not two, but three different chart of accounts. And at that point, you can actually centralize the master data management that we were discussing earlier. You stabilize, you standardize the information to map to one chart of account that is reliable. And the last piece is the ability to drill back in your information and analyze your information at either the highest level, because you now are maintaining the hierarchies, or at the lowest level, which is the one that you define in the subledger.